OldManSarge here. I'm here at my friend Derek's house, and we've decided we've watched a couple of the battle reports for different miniature war games, and we thought, let's do we've seen some strategic ones too, like this Global Axis and Allies, and we thought we'd give it a shot, try it out, and post it online, show you some strategies that we might use. So this is how the board's set out. Of course, those French and British guys out in the ocean are actually in France, but we just figured that they're going to die in the first turn, so we might as well just throw them out there so they're easy to get to. So this is how the board's set up initially. I'm sure you've seen this if you've played the game before, or if you haven't. Basically, the game starts in 1940, and Germany has already taken over Poland, and Russia and Germany have split Poland between them. And Germany is at war with France and Britain because they declared war on them when they took over Poland. They're at peace with the United States, and they're currently at peace with Russia. Japan's at war with China because it's been taken over all of its coastal areas, and it's currently at peace with everyone else. But it can declare war on everybody else if it so desires. So we'll get back to you after the first turn. I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through the Germany, Russia, and then Japan, and then we'll pause it. We'll basically come back to you guys, and we'll tell you kind of how that all came out, what they bought, and what they did. And then we'll finish the last part of the turn, and then we'll come back and basically do a synopsis of what the Allies done at the very end. Italy will be thrown in with them, of course. So we will be back after the first turn, after the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese go. All right, this is halfway. This is halfway through the first turn. So the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese have gone. So what happened with the Germans is they took France, of course, southern France, and also Normandy, and they actually did rather well in the rolls. They took the fleets out. They didn't lose any planes. The only plane they lost was when they went in against France. They did get an AA shot, lose one plane. I know I've heard a lot of people say you shouldn't do that, but I needed the extra strength because we were going all out with different parts. They took the neutral countries, and it's kind of interesting. We have Bulgaria represented by gray chits, or gray people, and we've got the Finns represented by white, just for fun. They bought 6 infantry and a transport. I wonder why they bought the transport. So now I got 2 transports. Russia pull back, which is, I guess, the normal strategy for a lot of Russian players, is they pull back from the front line. So Russia pulled back, and they actually pulled back over on this side too, trying to encourage the Japanese maybe to give them more Mongolian pieces, but the Japanese didn't do it. They went into China pretty hard and heavy, as you can see, and they moved their fleet, which is represented by this marker, but the fleet's actually right there. So the fleet in the Caroline Islands is 3 carriers. It's fairly large. Japan bought a couple transports and 4 infantry, so they've got now around the Japanese islands 6 transports and a smaller fleet there, ready to go. They might attack next turn, who knows. So now we're moving on to the US turn. We'll be right back after the United States, Britain, China, India, Australia, Italy, and France go. So we'll be back when everybody else finishes. So here we are at the end of the first turn. So both sides have gone. And the United States bought an aircraft carrier, flew a couple planes over. Has got a little bit of a fleet being built up there. There's one sub there that's convoyed, destroying some British shipping. The Brits were a little scared of the possibility of sea lion because there's 2 transports and there were 9 fighters, tactical and regular fighters in Western Germany, and 2 bombers. And so they attacked with their bomber and 2 fighters, or 3 fighters, and they lost quite a lot of power. They destroyed a fighter and a cruiser, but the Germans have their battleship left, which is damaged, but it will repair at the beginning of the Germans' turn. Italy did rather well this turn. Destroyed a couple British ships, took Gibraltar, took Greece, did not take Tunisia, tried, but lost a guy and decided to retreat. And then they spread out, as you can see, into Kenya and Anglo-Egypt, Sudan. The Brits tried to attack Ethiopia, but they lost everything, to the one loss of one Italian infantry. So the Italians rolled rather well, I should say. In India, the Brits essentially bought a tactical and a tank and moved their troops up. As you can see, China did a retaliatory move, lost their fighter in the process when they attacked Hunan, and the Japanese survived. But they did run about 6 infantry into Yunnan, which is the Burma Road, or part of the Burma Road, and then they put all the reinforcements there. So they're stacking it pretty heavy. They did take Sumatra for some extra money, and the Australians came over and took Java as well. And they bought an additional fighter for the Aussies. So in America, they kind of set up a couple fleets for blocking because they're a little bit afraid of these transports. And over here, the Americans kind of moved their fleets around a little bit, kind of put them all together. So we were talking about the possibility of Operation Sea Lion. So England, in response, put 6 infantry and an artillery in England and flew the fighter that was in Gibraltar up to England just to defend it, just in case. So we'll see if the Germans will attempt Operation Sea Lion, or whether they were just maybe trying to scare them, or what they were doing. So we'll be right back after the end of the Japanese turn for turn 2. So we're back at turn 2, after the Japanese have gone. So Germany is gone, Russia has gone, and so has the Japanese now. So we'll just show kind of what happened here. The Germans decided not to go after Operation Sea Lion. The British just powered up Britain just way too much, so they pulled off of that. They purchased 1 sub. They moved the 1 sub from New Brunswick over so they can hold on to their submarine for as long as possible. They bought 10 mechanized infantry and a fighter, I believe, a tank, and an artillery. That's what they bought with all that money that they had saved. Russia, and they also moved a ton of infantry. So this is actually like 24 infantry down here in Romania, with a ton of tanks or some tanks and some artillery. And the Russians basically have countered by moving their guys right outside of the Ukraine, a ton of their army, so a massive army there. And so that's kind of what it looks like now, and the Russians have their fleet up there in case Russia declares war on them next turn, which is probably going to happen. The Japanese are just decimating the Chinese. They took Yunnan back, and China basically only has 3 infantry and 5 spaces left. They have then, because of that, the Japanese decided to land their bombers over in, after they did their attacks over here, to kind of, I guess, put some pressure on the US and the Australians, because possibly the war will start next turn. And what they had bought is a couple transports, 3 subs, and a destroyer, just to kind of help the fleet out a bit. And this fleet right here, so there's a fleet marker. This represents this entire fleet here. So the entire fleet of the Japanese, 2 battleships, 3 carriers, 2 destroyers, looks like 2 cruisers, looks like 3 or 4 destroyers, and 2 subs, is all right there. So the Japanese, they've got some punching power now. And let's see what the United States, the Brits, the Italians will do, and what's left of the French. So we'll be back after everybody else completes their turns for turn 2. So here we are at the end of turn 2, and what has kind of happened in this round, the Italians got a little unlucky. They've been lucky so far, but they attempted to take Algeria. They landed some guys in Morocco, moved the guy from Libya up to Tunisia, and they wanted Algeria bad because that would have given them a $5 bonus, but they failed the attack. The 2 French infantry that were remaining attacked Tunisia, and they got killed as well. So there's no more French in the North Africa region. Italians moved up. They also sent in a destroyer and a fighter to try to take out that 1 cruiser right there so they can get the bonus for the no Allied ships in the Mediterranean. And they lost them both, and they failed. So the Italians had a kind of an unlucky turn, and it might be turning against them. Their money is a little bit less than it was last time. The Germans have tons of guys on the border still. The Italians moved up to support them, and the Russians still have their forces where they were since the last time that we filmed. The Brits in India, have moved up to try to support or threaten Yunnan, but they did not declare war. They took a little more of the money islands, and the Americans have basically set up this enormous screen around to try to protect Australia and the southern portion because of that 1 Japanese fleet. So they're kind of like waiting for them to make their strike. And French moved up to put their fleet in India. And so that's just kind of where we're at. Now the English, or the Britons, also did buy 2 destroyers and 2 transports to try to get this army, the Canadian army, into the mix. And Britain has still got 3 subs kind of around overall Britain. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We'll be back after turn number 3, halfway through, with the end of the Japanese turn. And here we are, we're back at the end of turn 3. The Germans and the Japanese and the Russians have gone. The Germans declared war on Russia, and they killed 1 little ship here, and then the Russians charged out with their submarine against the battleship and lost it. The Germans basically have, in this territory, they moved up 10 mech and 6 tanks, 4 infantry in this territory, 5 infantry there, and 4 Finns in the north there. And Russia has probably somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 20 infantry there. And then they moved their massive force, their southern force, which has like 20 infantry, 3 Bulgarian infantry, 4 tanks, and a bunch of artillery, 5 artillery. And there's Italians following them. And Russia essentially has got 2 big, huge armies. One of them in this territory, sitting 1 space away from that massive horde, and another one in Leningrad, trying to defend Leningrad from the assault. They are also moving their infantry back towards the capital. Japan declared war on everybody except for Russia. And Japan wiped out with their fighters. This is an example. 1 fighter and 1 tactical fighter went for each one of the ships near Wake Island, Marshall Islands, all the way down this ring that the Americans had placed. The Japanese essentially nullified it. They also moved a destroyer down, killed the U.S. sub and the Aussie transport that was there. They got kind of lucky on this island. The odds were about even, I would guess. They get 1 free shot, and then after that, everything kind of changed. So they took 3 of the, what they call, I guess, the money islands. Not much really defending them, but there isn't any transports that can take them back by the Australians nor the Brits. They've reduced India down to $9. And so now we're going to move on to the second half of the turn. We'll see what India does in response and what Australia does in response to this attack. And we'll see what they do to the Italians. probably going to start pushing the Italians back, and the Americans are now in the war, and they're the next ones to go. So the United States has a sizable fleet. There really isn't much that the Italians or the Germans have against that fleet. So it's kind of almost a race, I guess, maybe. Maybe the Germans are racing to get to Moscow to take it, and maybe the Americans are going to try to stop them. I don't know what they're going to do in the Pacific. The Americans have a decent-sized fleet, but it's not as big as the fleet that the Japanese have. The Japanese spread their fleet out a little bit. That marker is represented by 3 aircraft carriers, 3 subs, and a destroyer. So that's the battle so far. The ring that the Japanese have pushed out, there's no Chinese defense anymore. The Japanese have basically taken almost complete control of China. They left this territory open because, well, as you can see, there's a very large British force down here in Burma, and they didn't want to have to fight it. They want to be the ones, I guess, that strike the blow, and they've got all the aircraft to do so at the moment. So that's the end of this turn, the end of the Japanese turn, turn 3. So now we'll move on to the Allies. We've got America, we've got Britain, Italy, Australia, and France. And at the end of that, we'll be right back. So we're back again at the end of turn 3. And the Brits and the Americans have come over and taken Morocco and Gibraltar. The Italians pulled their fleet back. They did go over and take Syria with a transport. The British did attack the one cruiser that the Italians had in Sea Zone 97, and they both killed each other. And down in Africa, the Brits bought 3 tanks, and they also moved against the Kenya force that the Italians had and defeated them there. So the Brits are starting to mop up Africa, it looks like. The British moved into Siam and eliminated the 1 infantry there. The Indians, I should say. And they've got an enormous force there in Burma. But the Japanese haven't fought each other yet. I guess they're kind of waiting to see which one will blink first. The French did move their fleet over to take out a Japanese transport. The Australians were contemplating attacking this fleet in the Sea Zone, but they decided against it. Instead, moved them to Queensland so they can get some scramble support from those fighters there. And the United States moved their fleet to Hawaii. So their fleet's in defensive positions against the Japanese fleet. And again, this marker represents this fleet, which is 3 carriers, 3 subs, and a destroyer right now. So now we're moving on to turn 4. We'll be back to see what the Russians, the Germans, and the Japanese do in the first half of turn 4. Alright, we're at the end of the Germans, Russians, and Japanese turns. It was a pretty eventful round. The Germans built a couple fleets to help the Italians out because the Americans are knocking on the door. They're right outside the gates here. They built some infantry to kind of protect some of these areas. But the biggest event that took place was they attacked Leningrad with a ton of infantry and tanks and planes. And Leningrad held. It held with, like, I think 1 infantry, few artillery, a tank, and a bunch of planes, like 5 planes left. So Leningrad held, but the Russians decided it was time to fall back. So they actually pulled out of Leningrad, moved all their planes, which you can see a huge stack of them here in Moscow. And they pulled back. They're using the scorched earth policy. And they're bringing over all the infantry, looks like from Siberia, over to help. Japan had a very successful turn. They took China completely over, so China is now completely in Japanese hands. They built a minor industrial complex and a naval base for more force projection down there. And the Brits have a ton of troops in Burma, so we've got lots of Japanese and lots of Brits facing off each other down in the Burma region. The United States, which had their navy all up in Hawaii, the Japanese decided to strike. And so they flew their bombers, their air force, all their subs that they had, and they basically hurt each other really bad. The Japanese don't have any subs left, and the Americans' fleet is only down to what they purchased. The Japanese also moved to the Aleutian Islands just to try to take away some bonus dollars from the United States. And they decided to sacrifice a transport to take the Solomon Islands, again to make it a little more difficult, I think, for the Aussies to get their bonuses back. So that's the end of turn 4 for the Japanese, the Russians, and the Germans. And we'll be back with the end when the Italians, Americans, and the Indians, India, I guess, and Britain and France go. So we'll be back with the end of that turn. So here we are at the end of turn 4. It's been very eventful. This Italian cruiser has killed, I believe, a couple subs and then a fighter from the French. And he's survived the whole thing, so that's kind of like the MVP of this game so far. However, Egypt. The Italians came in with 7 infantry, a tank, and an artillery, and a mech. And the first roll, they missed every time. And the British killed the 4 infantry that landed, and so the Italians just pulled back. So that's kind of what happened there. The Italians did go get some reinforcements from the Iraqis, and then they did move up here. The British mopped up the Italians in Africa. There's only like 1-2 spots left that the Italians own in Africa. In North Africa, they're starting to march across, and they did a Normandy invasion. Landed 2 tanks and 2 infantry, the Americans did. And then the British also. So they've controlled the English Channel, and the Germans just don't have the power to really deal with that right now. Over here, on this side of the table, the Brits bought a fighter, and they put a destroyer for a blocking force because of the Japanese purchase of the naval base and minor industrial complex. The 2 transports that the Japanese had out, the Australians killed them. The Australians are a little scared, and so they're building some infantry and a sub, try to hold the Japanese off. And the Americans, they took out the transport in the Aleutians, and then they bought a couple more transports, or another transport, I guess. So the Americans are going to try to rebuild their navy. So this is kind of what the game looks like at the end of turn 4. It's still kind of up in the air. I don't think that it's anybody's game yet. We'll see how the Russians actually did a very good job in holding the Germans back, and I think that was very crucial in Leningrad. Cost the Germans dearly with a lot of infantry. So we will be back. This is turn 5. We'll be back at the end of turn 5. Or, I mean, at the end of the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese turn 5. So we'll be right back. So we're at the end of turn 5, and or not the end of turn 5, the end of the Japanese turn 5. So the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese have gone. So we'll just concentrate on kind of those areas of the board. Germany pushed America out of Normandy. Also moved some guys down to Italy just in case the Italian border or the one ship breaks and he can get through. They did take Leningrad finally, only because the Russians pulled back. The Russians counterattacked and took Belarus back and this other territory here. The Germans moved up with their massive force of like 18 infantry and 4 tanks up to Rostov. So they're on their march. The Russians have a ton of infantry. What does the blue represent?
20. So
they have 21 infantry in Russia right now, which actually outnumbers the Rostov force by I think 1 guy. But they have actually another 18 infantry coming in. So yeah, the Russians are going to have tons of infantry to throw. The Japanese are protecting their borders. their newly acquired territory of China. They built up a very large force down here and flew their bombers that they had over on the other side of the world over. The Brits haven't gone yet, so we won't really, and the Americans haven't really gone yet. The Japanese did station an air force over in the Aleutian Islands to threaten the American coastline there. And so that's kind of where we're at. The Australian ship was destroyed, and so was the English ship that was blocking the possible transport into India. So we're going to move on to the Americans, the English, the India, basically and Australia, and Italy, and we'll be back after that. So we're at the end of the overall turn 5, and what has basically happened is a lot of things with the Brits. The Brits moved across. They actually landed in Libya with an infantry, an infantry and artillery, and then the tank drove from Algeria over and took Libya, took it over, and then the Italians counterattacked with a mechanized, an infantry, and a fighter, and everything died except for the fighter, and the fighter flew back to Tobruk. There was an artillery in Alexandria. The Aussies decided they were going to just bonsai charge them, and they ended up winning and killing it. So the only place that Italy's in North Africa anymore is in Tobruk. However, Italy did build an industrial complex in Iraq, and they're getting quite a few bonus dollars now, $6 for having those 3 territories, Iraq, Persia, and the Northwest Persia. And they took out the French unit that was in Transjordan so that it'd be harder to get Iraq back. The Brits still have a transport down there. They still have 3 tanks, but they have no way of actually in one turn getting a troop to the Iraq territory. So looks like the Italians might get at least one buy out of that factory. The Brits in India moved over and attacked the one destroyer that was there from Japan, killed it, but they took a hit in the process. And the Australian Navy decided to sail up to also aid the Brits in the defense of India, since the Japanese look like they are putting a lot of effort into getting ready to move towards it. So the Japanese have 5 infantry in Guangxi, I think it's called, and then they have another like 8 infantry or 9 infantry in French Indochina, a bunch of planes, and 6 artillery. But the Brits in Burma have probably as many infantry and artillery, so it's an even match right now, except for maybe the air power is a little heavier on the Japanese side. The Americans have built up a force up near the United States to try to, perhaps, I'm not sure exactly what the plans are for the Allied player, but perhaps to threaten the Aleutian Island chain, because once that chain is taken, it's been reduced the American dollars by 5. So that's kind of where we're at as far as this side of the map. And Britain, they just landed a British guy on Belgium because it was unoccupied, and if you think about it, it's worth $3 and completely makes sense because they just exchanged money for it, but it forces the Germans to have to take some action on it. And so that's where we're at the end of turn 5. So we're going to move on to turn 6. Alright, so we are at the end of turn 6 for the Japanese, the Germans, and the Russians. So we still have half the board to go for turn 6. But this is kind of what happened. Germany built a sub in southern France, built another sub in the Baltic, and built a bunch of infantry, and moved infantry down into Italy to protect it. It also took Holland back, and it also took out the American destroyer that was up there. On this, on the Russian front, Germany moved out Archangel, They also took out the unit that was in Belarus, and they took the big news, of course, is they took Stalingrad and they took the Caucasus region without any, I guess, anybody taking them back. They did take Tambov, the Bulgarian units did, but they were then taken out by the Russians. And by the way, that Russian, that's a 20 chit there, so they actually have 28 infantry in Russia right now, and another 10 or 12 right outside of it. So pretty significant. The Japanese are, they made a mistake, and they tried to take the Chinese guy out, but they made an error on it, and so it ended up costing 1 point plus whatever China might be able to build if they've got enough money. Now Japan has 14 infantry in French Indochina, 6 artillery, 4 tanks, a mech, and 6 planes total, plus a bomber. They did try to bomb. They got one of their bombers shot down, but they still have 1 bomber left. They did a little bit of damage to the factory there. They also took Malaysia, and the Brits are in Burma still, but now they have a threat of being able to be invaded with 3 transports, because there's a naval base in French Indochina as well. The battleship died, but it did take out a plane in the process, and there was a fleet that the Australians had moved into Java, the Java Sea, but that was taken out by the Japanese as well. The other news is the Japanese decided to evacuate the Aleutian Islands. They had 4 fighters there. They have moved them back to Japan, and those 3 that were in Japan that were going to go there decided to go down south instead. And the Australians still have Australia proper under control. But the Japanese did get all of the other islands that they needed to get their additional bonus. So they actually got $73 this turn. So now we're going to move on to the Americans, then the Brits and India, and then Italy and Australia. And we will be right back with those moves. We are at the end of turn 6, so the Brits, the Indians, Australians, Italians, and the French have gone. And so this is kind of where we're at. And the Americans gone. So the Americans took out the 1 sub that the Germans had. They also took out the Italian fleet that was there. The Italians rebuilt 1 destroyer, and they built 3 tanks, and they moved 2 infantry back, so now they have 5 pieces versus 4 tanks and an artillery and a plane. And Britain also built 3 infantry and 3 infantry for the transport, and Union of South Africa as well. Britain decided it was time to move back from Burma, and so they pulled their troops back. The Aussies have moved out with their submarines since there's no destroyers for the Japanese to stop it. And they went up and destroyed the transport. The Americans moved up and retook Midway, so the one time that the Japanese got their $5 bonus is now gone. And so this is what the board looks like at the end of turn 5. The Japanese are still doing quite well. They're in many different places of the world, but they're starting to get stopped. The Russians and the Germans are kind of playing a little dance around here, around the capital of Russia. And the Brits and the Americans are trying to really put the pressure on Italy, which they are, because Italy is no longer really in North Africa. The only toehold they have left is over here in Iraq and the Persian areas. We'll be right back with turn 7, and we'll do the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese once again. We'll be right back. Okay, we are at turn 7. So this is the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese have gone. The Germans moved a fighter down to try to help a little bit on the Italian peninsula. They retook Normandy, They built a bunch of infantry and another fighter in Germany proper. They took some territories right next to the Russian capital, and the Russians struck out with one guy on each one of the territories and I guess killed a couple Germans. One of them was here in Samara, and they took it. The other two, Tamov and Archangel, the Germans actually were lucky and they killed the Russians back. There are literally, this stack right here is 40, how much is it? 41 infantry? 41 infantry in Russia. Insane. The Germans hold all the territory around Russia, but 41 infantry is a lot to deal with, so I don't know when that's going to actually take place. The Germans also flew their Air Force down into Iraq, 3 planes, to try to stop the Brits from taking it, because the Brits actually have an ability to throw quite a bit of power at Iraq, and the Germans also have a counterattacking force in northwest Persia, just in case. Japan, since Burma was left open, Japan walked in very easily, but they also moved a very large force into the Shan state. 4 tactical bombers, 3 fighters, 4 tanks, 13 infantry, and 7 artillery. They also have 3 infantry and 3 tanks, and a bunch of other ships, and transports, the ability to transport guys over to India. They took out the Chinese guy finally. They put a blocking ship up against the American fleet, and they built a fleet of their own, another carrier and a couple destroyers and a couple transports. Try to stop the Americans from messing with their plans. So now we're going to move on to the United States, China, which can't go because they don't have any territory, India, England, and Australia, and Italy. So we'll be right back after all of that. Turn 7, this is midway through. Here we are at the end of turn 7. So we're just going to kind of go over the board. I think we're maybe midway through the game. I don't know if it usually lasts 14 turns or not. But we'll go over here first. We have Normandy. The Americans first attacked it. Then the British reinforced it. So the Germans have an air force and 5 infantry to maybe take it back. America moved over and they took out a ship, and then they went down with their submarine, and now the Italians have built a destroyer to try to maybe take the Mediterranean back. Let's see. Let's go to Russia. So Russia still has an enormous amount of infantry, as we talked about earlier. The Italians moved up a little bit to give the Germans, I guess, a little bit of a shield, because we don't know when those Russians might decide to come out of the country of Russia proper. Down in Egypt, you've got the British pulled back, built an industrial complex, and reinforced it. And the Italians moved up. I think they're expecting the Germans to follow them in the quest for Egypt. So far, it's eluded Italy. They've tried one time, and it completely failed when they missed every single die roll. The Italians did build a sub, because there really isn't anything in the ocean that can deal with the sub at the current moment. The Britain and England, or in India, basically attacked Burma and killed that one guy, and they built an artillery, so they're kind of just waiting, I guess, for the Japanese to make their final move. Australia finally builds a transport, so I'm not sure what their plans are, whether they're going to try to get their bonus dollars back, or whether they're going to maybe go off to the Money Islands and maybe divert some attention from the Japanese have on the British in India. The Americans, now this is an interesting move, concentrated their entire fleet in Midway and built a naval base. And as you can see, there is a bit of Japanese Navy here, but the interesting about this move is normally you can throw up a blocking ship to try to stop the fleets from being able to get around, but because you put a fleet or a base there, there's literally, like, you can go to 15 and then to 1 and then to Japan, or 15, or you can go to 16 then to Japan, or you can go 24, 17 then to Japan. I'm not sure, doesn't look like you can get to it. So those 3 locations, the Japanese do have 3 destroyers, so they could block all 3, but maybe that's what the United States wants, is to kind of draw out the destroyers so they can kill them. Japanese still have the Aleutian Islands, so the United States still's missing $5 from their bonus pool. So that's basically kind of where we're at. Japan is concentrating a large amount of its force, as much as they can, I guess, against India. I don't know if they've got enough troops yet, but maybe they'll move in. We'll see. Over here in Egypt, will Egypt be able to hold out for the second time? So far the British have done very good in holding Egypt and taking the Italians out of the Mediterranean. And the United States has helped, of course. And this fleet that's right here is actually right there. And as you can see, they've got a carrier, a couple transports, and a destroyer for the Americans, and then 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers for the Brits. And there's 2 French guys on a British transport right now. They'll be dropped off next turn. So that's where we are at the end of turn 7. We will be moving to turn 8, and we'll get back when the Germans, the Japanese, and the Russians have completed their particular turns. So we're going to go halfway through it again, and we'll be back, and we'll let you know how this turn turns out. Alright, well, we're back on turn 8 with the Germans had gone. They basically pushed the Brits and the Americans out of Normandy again. The Germans took out a transport. The Germans kept their guys in northwest Persia and built some more tanks. Tried to surround Russia some more. Russia fought back, took one of the territories, and killed an Italian artillery and infantry, and then another German infantry around the Russian capital. And then Russia just continued to build. They have got 2 tacticals now and 7 planes and a large number of tanks. Japan finally made the move, pushing into Burma. They moved everything up. They moved a large fleet down with a bunch of infantry and tanks and artillery in striking distance of Burma, and they moved their subs over, of India, and they moved their subs over as well into the convoy zone. And they actually went up. They put a little blocking force in to stop the Americans from maneuvering around and maybe hitting Japan. And they put their they actually took over Alaska with a couple guys. And that's basically the Japanese turn. So turn 8, this is what the board looks like. We'll be back after the Americans, Brits, Aussies go, turn 8. So now we're at the end of turn 8. So the Americans, they moved their fleet up to Gibraltar, Morocco area, and they offloaded troops. The Italians moved a destroyer over to block, hopefully block an attack by the Americans. Americans pulled their sub back. The British continued to build up Egypt. The Italians pulled back and left one guy in Transjordan, which the Australians with 2 men charged him and killed him. The Italians moved their sub off of the coast of India. The Brits in India made an attack, and then after 1 round of combat pulled back. They actually took out 2 more infantry than they lost. The Australians moved their fleet out to threaten the Japanese. The Americans took the Caroline Islands, and the Australians also took New Britain. Hopefully, maybe they can get their money back, their bonus dollars. And that's what the board looks like right now. The Americans also built some troops to try to thwart the Japanese attempts to take over North America through Alaska. So we're now moving to turn 9, and we'll be back after the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese go. And we'll show you what that looks like. Oh yeah, one last important maneuver. The Brits and the Americans attacked and liberated Leningrad for the Russians. And there really isn't a German force that can stop them at the moment. We'll be back on for turn 9. So we're at turn 9. The Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese have gone. The Germans basically built up 3 tanks in Germany, Western Germany, 10 mechanized in Germany. And the reason they did that is to try to counter this resurgence of Russia in Leningrad, thanks to the British, and the French are there to assist them as well. The Russians are expanding a little more in the north as well to try to retake their territories. They also flew out and took a German tank that was trying to blitz across Siberia with a fighter and a tactical. Germany continues to build here. They didn't really do much in this area. They did take the Australian guy out of that territory. The big news for this turn, however, is the Japanese have finally taken India. So that fleet marker there is represented by that fleet right there. 5 transports, 3 subs, 2 battleships, 2 carriers, 2 battleships, and 2 cruisers. And then they just basically did a blocking pattern out here to try to stop the United States from thinking about going after Japan. And then they tried with their meager forces to put up a kind of a defense on French Indochina. They just don't know where the Americans, with that fleet and 2 tanks and a number of infantry, are planning to go. The Australians are going to be going next. The United States, Australians, the British, but not India, because India is now gone, and Italy. And then we'll be back at the end of turn 9. This is the end of turn 9. The Americans moved their fleet from Gibraltar up to the English Channel and took Normandy. So the Normandy give and take is taking place again. They built a destroyer and a cruiser on that side. They moved their fleet over the north so they could avoid being hit by the aircraft from Germany. The Brits blitzed out of Novgorod and took the Baltic states and Poland. And then they also took Finland and relieved a couple points additional for the Russians. The Italians took out the American sub by Gibraltar, built a couple destroyers around Italy, and once the British went through the Suez Canal, because they had taken Jordan from the Germans, the Italians retook it. So the Germans and the British and the Italians are staring each other across. And then Italian sub moved over to do some convoying. Britain's gone in India. Australia saved their money, didn't buy anything this turn, and moved a lot of stuff back, reinforced the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy took this island here. Didn't want to go to the Philippines, was a little bit nervous that it would have been hit harder. And the United States took back British Columbia. They have a tank there in Western Canada. And they built some more transports and some more guys. So we will return for turn 10. So far it's been a very bloody game. I'm not sure really who has the upper hand, because again there's 32 infantry in Russia. Russia's resurging because of the British assistance. They stopped the Germans from blitzing across Siberia, and the Germans don't have that many as many troops, infantry troops and such, in the southern portion of Russia as the Russians have in Moscow. However, the Germans did build 10 mech, so they may be planning on coming across and retaking maybe Leningrad from the Brits and the Russians. So that's where we're at. Turn 10. We'll be back with turn 10. Sorry, that was turn 9. We'll be back with turn 10. And Japan is 1 victory point city away from winning on the Pacific side. Okay, we're midway through turn 10, so the Japanese, Russians, and Germans have gone. And what happened was the Germans moved their remaining 2 subs down in the English Channel, and they attacked it with all their air power. The Brits scrambled from the United Kingdom, and the fleet that the British had was destroyed. The 2 subs and a couple fighters from the Luftwaffe were gone as well. The Germans took back Normandy. The Germans built, they took back Poland that the Brits had 1 tank in, and they built 10 more mech. They moved up 4 infantry to Norway, and the 4 infantry that were in Norway attacked with a fighter against Finland and took out the British tank and retook Norway, or Finland. And here the Germans just built more infantry, so they're almost at par with the Russians, but not quite yet. The Russians, on the other hand, have retaken large swaths of northern Russia from the Germans. There's only 1 little marker that the Germans have left in that area, and the rest of it's basically southern Russia and a little bit on the Baltic coast as well. The Germans decided that instead of just keeping their tanks in northwest Persia, they moved them all with their air power to Jordan to assist the Italians in trying to take Egypt. They've tried this a number of times to take Egypt, but have failed every time. The Japanese moved their 10 tanks and mech across West India and western Persia, and it looks like they're going to either assist the Germans in Russia or possibly Africa. On this coast, the Japanese, with their big Navy marker, which is representative by all those ships there. Not damaged ship should be not damaged anymore, but they moved that all there, and they've got like 4 transports to pick up the artillery and infantry. They retook Java from the Australians. They moved up another large fleet from Japan down to the Philippines, because the American fleet marker, which is representative right there, is fairly significant for them to have to deal with. They took out a U.S. destroyer in one of the open sea zones. They built 2 battleships and a destroyer, a couple transports, a bunch of infantry to face off against that, 2 destroyers and submarine potentially. And now we're going to, and they did take out an American transport with that destroyer. So now we're going to move on to the United States, then Britain, and then Australia, and this is turn 10 for them, and Italy, and we'll be back at the end of those turns. This is the end of turn 10, so we're about ready to move on to turn 11. Essentially, up in this neck of the woods, the Brits moved their mighty fleet, which is right there, which is 4 transports, 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, with the American fleet right next to England. The Americans moved a fleet over. They've got nothing else coming, it doesn't look like at the current moment. Let's see. The Brits, Italy tried to take Egypt, wore it down quite a bit, but was unable to take it. 1 fighter holds it. The British built 2 destroyers in Johannesburg, South Africa. The Italians they figured that Egypt's going to fall, so they're starting to move their stuff into Russia, it looks like. Over here, this was kind of interesting. The United States landed troops up in Manchuria, and we forgot to do something, so we'll be right back in just 1 second to do it real quick. What we forgot to do was China actually got $3 and got to go because America freed Manchuria. So they bought a man because they had $3 and they got $3 more for next turn. But the United States essentially moved their fleet, which is consisting of 2 carriers and 2 transports, into around the Okinawan Island, and then they tried to build a screen around it to try to bottle up the Japanese Navy. Again, that fleet marker represents that fleet. And then we already went over that. The Australians took out the cruiser with a couple subs and the destroyer, and they also took out a Japanese destroyer around the Solomon Islands. So, and then the Americans, they're building quite a few ships and sending them towards Japan. So they've got 3 destroyers and a sub within striking distance of Japan, and then they also have some reinforcements coming in there. And they took back the Aleutians in Alaska, so now they're up to their full bonus again. So now we're moving to turn 11. We're going to go with, again, the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese. And then we'll be back for a little quick report on that, and then we'll finish up the turn with the Americans, British, Australians, and Italians. So we'll be right back. So we're midway through turn 11. The Germans essentially just built up, put a lot of guys kind of for counterattacking force in France and in Western Germany. There's no ships transporting ability in the Mediterranean, so they moved their Italian defense force up into France. They also did what the Italians could not. They took Egypt. They also have moved up. Each stack is 10 mechanized infantry. And then they have a bunch more up there in Finland. And the Russians decided to pull back. And the Germans right now are on parity with the Russians. The Russians counterattacked the Italians and took their territories back. Japan used its fleet of submarines to go underneath the U.S. cruiser and attack the carriers, which they did, and they destroyed them, and the planes landed in Manchuria. They took out the rest of the screen with various planes and ships in different places, and the Australian sub left too. And then they landed 6 infantry and 6 artillery in Western Australia, and they combined their fleets. So now they've got 4 carriers, a battleship, couple battleships, and a cruiser, and 6 transports. The American fleet marker is now off the board. And then they used their aircraft that they flew up to take out some of the ships to land in various territories to stop the United States from taking more of China and threatening their victory point cities. And then they built within Japan, they built 3 fighters, 4 destroyers, a couple transports, because they're going to try to stop the United States. And they have got some little guys moving up to potentially defend Shanghai if they can get up there in time. And that is essentially the end of turn 11 for the Axis, or for the Japanese, the Germans, and the Russians. We'll now move on to the Americans, the Brits, the Italians, and the Australians. And the Australians have quite a bit to deal with right now. So we'll be right back. We're at the end of turn 11. So what has happened this turn is Britain built up some troops on England, I guess to threaten, but they only have one complex down here. They actually built a transport so they could use that to perhaps take Egypt from Germany. They moved a blocking force to Alexandria. They moved their fleet up to the Greece area. The Italians just start slow moving their infantry and artillery, and they're just building tanks. Australia put up a blocking force to just try to stop the Japanese fleet and the 12 infantry from getting over there. The United States made an attempt to attack the fleet, but Japan held with 2 aircraft around the waters. And the United States is using the Alaskan chain, I guess, to ferry things over and threaten Japan proper. The Chinese are coming back slowly. They got a couple guys. And the Brits pulled also out of Leningrad to go and maybe help the Russians defend. And that's where we are at the end of turn 11, where we'll be moving on to turn 12. We'll be right back. Okay, we are halfway through turn 12. So the Japanese, the Russians, and the Germans have gone. The Germans flew all their air force over, moved up all their mechs, moved up their infantry from the Volga, or the Stalingrad. So it looks like Russia and Moscow is going to be a big fight next. The Russians did do a massive attack against this territory here, wiped out 10 mechs and then 4 infantry and a couple fighters as well, and then retreated. They were the player that was playing and was talking and saying, "I hope I don't kill them all because then I lose Moscow." But he ended up hurting them quite bad, and then he retreated back to defend his homeland. So that's kind of what's gone over there. And Japan finally declared war on Russia. They moved up their 10 tanks into the Stalingrad region for a counterattacking force in case the Germans don't succeed. They also moved up a couple infantry to Novorossiysk, but they did not go next to Mongolia because they didn't want to trigger the infantry in Mongolia. The Japanese liberated Korea, and they also attacked Manchuria, but they failed in Manchuria. They wiped out the American fleet that was here, which was 4 destroyers and a transport. And they also put themselves in a position where I don't think the Americans can get to Japan in one turn with those transports because there's no combat ship with them. In Australia, they just kind of turtle forward a little bit, trying to maybe draw the Australians to come out and fight. And they moved a little bit of their fleet on each side. So who knows what their exact plans are, but they're in striking distance of the Aussies right now. So, and they built another little force up here, I guess maybe to go help Australia if it doesn't succeed. So we'll be back after the Americans, the Brits, the Aussies, and the Italians go. End of turn 12. Brits took Normandy. The last hurrah, potentially. The Americans and Brits are taking a little bit of money away from the Italians. The Brits tried to take Egypt. They actually succeeded, but they didn't want to lose their planes, so they let Egypt go. I guess maybe they're just kind of tired. The Italians moved up into Russia just in case the Germans and the Japanese fail at taking the capital of Russia. The Brits retook Leningrad. It's a victory point city, so trying to maybe hold on to a potential, keep the game going a little bit longer. The Australians pulled back with everything into the capital. The Americans kind of think they might be just a little tired as well. They built up an enormous fleet, but they didn't They stopped trying to go after Japan because they didn't really have the power anymore, and they realized it. And then the Manchurians, the Chinese, who are back in the game, they might only be in the game for one turn left. So this looks like it's probably going to be an Axis victory. It probably looked like that a long time ago, but we wanted to play it out, and we wanted to just see if there was any possibility the Americans could at least delay them, if not maybe pull it around with maybe some of the Russian assistance. The Russians have quite a few guys in there. That's a 20 chit, so they've got 21 infantry. They've got a ton of planes, probably 7 or 8 fighters. So we'll be back after turn 13. This could be the final turn. I think actually it might be on both sides of the map. We might have an Axis victory on each side of the map because I think Germany has the sufficient number of cities if they can take Leningrad and Russia in one turn. And the Japanese, I believe all they need is one more city, and that could potentially be Australia. So we'll be back with the potential last turn of the game. We'll stop midway with the Japanese and Germans and Russians and just give you a recap of what's happened on the European and the Far East, and then we'll go the last few turns to see if the cities can be retaken. So we'll return. Okay, we are here at the end of turn 13. We basically have the Axis winning on both sides of the table at the same time. The massive battle that took place in Russia, 7 tanks, a lot of bombers, and a few fighters and tactical fighters were remaining. So Russia fell. That means that because they have Egypt and they have Russia and they have France, they have all the victory cities they need to claim victory on the European side. On the other side of the map, this battle was actually extremely close. So here's the fleet marker for the Japanese. Here is what's left of the Japanese fleet. So Japan lost 3 tactical, 3 fighters in the process of attacking. They lost 5 infantry, I believe, and 4 artillery. And that's what they survived with. So Japan barely took Australia, and in fact there were a couple times that it could have gone either way. And that would have just been a pride thing for the Allied player to have won Australia and held on. So this is basically the end of the game. As far as the tactics go, for the Japanese, all I did basically with the Japanese this particular game was I looked at the game in phases. So on my head I was thinking, phase 1 I needed to go do this. I needed to take the Money Islands, which are right here. That was like phase number 1. I wanted to put guys in New Britain and the Solomon Islands, or at least New Britain at the very minimum, because I figured that Australia getting $5 a turn bonus just for having all of its original territories, and all I have to do to break that is take 1 territory. And as long as I'm strong enough at the beginning of the game, there's really not much Australia can do to stop that. That also, in fact, stops Australia from getting the additional $5 bonus for having Malaya in Allied hands and all the territories. So by taking New Britain, if you think about it, for the Japanese player, whoever might play them in the future, just by simply taking New Britain, you stop $10, a $10 swing in bonus money for the Australians. Now, New Britain's not worth any money, to Japan, but it is worth because it takes $5 away, or $10, a potential $10 away from the Australian player. So it's pretty important to at least make an attempt at the beginning of the game, at the minimum, to do something, in my opinion, to stop the Aussies from harassing you, especially since they're in really short distance from the Money Islands, which are, all of these, and gives you a $5 bonus for the Japanese. I did take the bonus dollar for having all the other islands, which I think was Wake Island, Guam. I can't remember. Solomon Islands, I think, is one of them. Midway is another one. Yeah, I had those 1 turn, but that was just kind of just a novelty. I don't know if it's really worth it. That's a lot of power that you'd have to. But I mean, if you're close to getting them, you might as well take it. The other thing that was kind of interesting is if the United States loses its transports in the game somehow, if Japan just simply has a transport and they move some men up to the Aleutian Islands, that's a $5 bonus that they can take away from the United States. But if the Americans have transports or a way to retake it, I don't really think that's quite worth it. But because there's no reason to fight that distance. But if the Americans don't have transports for whatever reason, because they're spending all their time against Germany, then that's actually not a bad move, I think. I don't know if going to Alaska, because it's the same bonus dollars, but see, Alaska can be retaken quite easily. The Aleutians, they have to invest a little more time with transports and troops to retake it. So I think the Aleutians is probably a better move if the opportunity presents itself. So I think Japan is more of an opportunistic nation to play than Germany. You're kind of looking just for some openings that the Allied player would leave you, and then trying to take advantage of those open spots. China, I don't know. I've heard different people online talk differently about China, whether you should go after it or whether you should just completely evacuate it, or whether you should fight for it somehow. I guess it just depends on how the Chinese player is playing and kind of what kind of tools that they have to fight against you. So that's kind of my opinion of Japan. I also did play Italy and Germany, and my strategy for Germany right off the bat, and it was pretty obvious, I think. Well, that's not true. The German player, at the very beginning, I've seen different people play different tactics with the Germany, with buying an aircraft carrier, for example. I just think that's nuts myself, because it just opens the door for Russia to basically, have your free lunch, basically. Because if the Russian player sees you buying aircraft carriers or massive navy for Germany, I just think the Russian player is just like, thank you very much, and is going to totally take advantage of it. But I've seen people claim it's the great strategy online. I think all you really honestly have to do is buy a transport, because if you have two transports right there and you destroy the British Navy, the Brits have to react by defending Britain to some extent. And that's just money that you've shifted, that they could have put in Africa, for example, and you shifted it up again from Italy. You shifted it up to have to deal with you. And if they don't put enough up there, you have enough fighters and enough ground troops with 4 troops landing that I think you could possibly pull off Operation Sea Lion. But it's still kind of a long shot to do it. But I think it's possibly worth doing. Italy's goal, I think, is to mess with England. Try to get its bonus dollars. The money down here and for Italy is really not worth a whole bunch, but it's the bonus dollars it's worth it. So Gibraltar, Greece, southern France, or southern France, Greece, and Egypt would be kind of your goal, and also eliminating the navies that the British or the Americans might have in the Mediterranean, so you can get your $5 bonus. Also, if you get an opportunity to come over to Persia, I think it's totally worth it, because there's $6 there plus $4, so that's a $10 that the Italians can have. So those are kind of my opinions of the way the game goes. Of course, other people will have their own opinions and beliefs on how things should run and operate. But I think if you notice that even with all that effort I put against Russia, I had the second turn, I think I bought 10 mechanized infantry, and I hit Russia as hard as I could with as much as I could. Even after doing that, the Russian player had tons of power. I mean, if I don't do that, I think Russia is just going to roll over Germany. But that's my opinion. So I'll ask my opponent if he has any thoughts that he'd like to share on the game that we played, or strategies or tactics for the Allied side.
Just make sure, especially with Britain, it's in the Union Jack. I mean, you want to. It's very easy to want to turtle, especially with China. You got to help them. It seems like if China dies too early, then Japan can really focus on you. If you keep China alive, they can really be a thorn in the side, take money away, possibly threaten big money on the shore if you keep them alive long enough.
Yeah.
And then just know your routes in the Pacific with the United States. I mean, knowing the different sea routes, there was a few that I was not aware of. And
Well, you pulled the one in Alaska kind of later in the game. Maybe it was too late when you did it, but that was kind of interesting because it's actually not too far away from Japan.
no,
And I've seen people put like industrial complexes, naval bases, air bases, whatever, up in Alaska, and it seems to put a psychological threat against the Japanese player.
the other thing that I wish I would have done was to build an air base in Gibraltar, because then you can scramble from there to keep the Italian or German player from blocking the Mediterranean. Then you can threaten Rome more effectively. That's one thing I wish I would have done first turn, or as soon as possible.
Sure.
Would have been worth the money. Absolutely. So.
Any other thoughts? You held on to Egypt and in Africa for. I mean, you actually conquered Africa, to be honest, until the German player came down from Russia to threaten you. So I actually think it was a good game. I don't know at what point it was swayed really heavily in the Axis side, or whether it could have been turned. But we'll be playing another game in the future, and whether my opponent wants to switch sides and play the Axis, or whether he wants to play the Allies again and try some different techniques and strategies, we'll definitely film it, and we'll put it online for everybody else to enjoy. So I want to thank you for watching this video of Axis and Allies Global 2nd Edition. And this is September of 2015, just in case you want to date it for some reason. If you have any questions or any comments, you can always comment down below. Otherwise, we'll be posting some more games. Thanks for watching.